Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for July 19th, 2023. After John F. Kennedy's death, Robert F. Kennedy, his brother, was searching for strength to renew a purpose for his life. His whole life up to that point had been at the side of his brother. He played an important role in getting John Kennedy elected as president. He was his attorney general. He was his chief advisor. He played a leading role in two of the most important major missions of John F. Kennedy's presidency. First, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which he played an important part in diffusing the crisis and coming to a recognition that peace with Russia was necessary, he made a major commitment to a peace process which included ending the Cold War and seeking peace globally. And secondly, he was committed to addressing the inequalities in American life, which meant supporting the civil rights movement and overcoming poverty. When his brother was killed and the cover-up went immediately into effect, he was put into a depression, a sense of purposelessness for a period of time. And it was after his brother's death that the Vietnam War was escalated, that President Johnson continued the Cold War tensions. And after a period of seeking an idea of what to do, he ran for the U.S. Senate in New York and was elected, and then decided to run for president in 1968 to complete the mission. As part of this search for a renewed purpose, he turned to the Greek classics, especially philosophy and tragedy, to seek out ideas on how to fight for the good, in spite of the evil that we face. This came in handy as his campaign developed, because the world was becoming increasingly violent. On the night of Martin Luther King's murder, he gave a powerful speech in Indianapolis, Indiana, calling for love, not hate, for solidarity to continue Martin Luther King's mission and his campaign against both the Vietnam War and against poverty and inequality, and not just in the United States, but in the world. Drawing on his study of the Greek philosophers and tragedy, he said to the crowd gathered that night in Indianapolis, quote, "Let us dedicate ourselves to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world," unquote. 2 months later, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, and no one stepped forward to fulfill the mission of the Kennedy brothers. No one stepped forward to solve the question of who did the murder and why. And there's been no challenge to the power of the military-industrial complex controlling U.S. policy since that time. The military-industrial complex, which was responsible for both murders as well as the murder of Dr. King and the cover-up. And the U.S. has been at war ever since, with the United States and the United Kingdom at the center of what was called the sole superpower, or the idea of the rules-based order or unipolar order. We've seen permanent warfare. We've seen economic blackmail against countries that are trying to develop. We see coups against leaders who try to break out from under this control. We see color revolutions to overthrow governments that won't submit to the rules. We see assassination of those who are strong and are committed to fight for the sovereign interests of their nation and their people and for cooperation with other nations. And what is put in place of these leaders? Imposed backwardness on billions of people through the deployment of what some people call economic hitmen working on behalf of the global banks to prevent the development of nations. This is what John Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy were fighting during their lives, which were cut short by the people they were fighting. Now today, this continues. We're in another permanent war. We're seeing a so-called Great Reset, which is just another term for the control over credit and spending in the hands of private banks, private financial institutions, and private central banks. We see the so-called Green Revolution, which is a deliberate effort to prevent the science and technology which can help overcome poverty for billions of people in the world. The war in Ukraine today is designed to prevent Russia from playing a leadership in breaking out of from underneath this rules-based order. And the warnings of a possible war against China, the same thing. As we see nations stepping forward through institutions such as the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, with 40 other nations wishing to join, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the African Union, and many, many more institutions, Eurasian Economic Union, institutions that are fighting for the sovereignty of their nations and for mutual policies of development. Instead, we're seeing more war, more sanctions, and sanctions which are killing millions. Sanctions which kill men, women, and children indiscriminately in countries whose governments refuse to submit to the demands of the rules-based order. This is an anti-colonial movement which is developing against this policy. This was a movement that John F. Kennedy recognized when he was a senator from Massachusetts in several speeches during the 1950s, which he warned that it would be a mistake to ignore the growing nationalism of the former colonial nations, and instead we should do what we can to work with them, to make life more gentle for the people who have been the victims of centuries of colonial domination. Well, as these countries move forward, and it's a reconstitution in a sense of the non-aligned movement of the 50s when Kennedy was giving these speeches, they're rejecting the policies of the City of London and Wall Street and the European Union. There's a glimpse, or I should say a glimmer, of that lost past in the candidacy of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. for president, especially in his opposition to the continued war in Ukraine and his discussion of the importance of defeating the corporate cartels that have a stranglehold on the institutions of government. This is what Lyndon LaRouche called the permanent bureaucracy. Some people call it the deep state. It's actually a permanent bureaucracy controlled by these corporate cartels for the benefit of the billionaires who run the military-industrial complex and their shareholders, but against the interests of billions of people on the planet. Helga Zepp-LaRouche has stepped forward with the idea of a higher peace movement, not just to stop the war, although that's essential, that's urgent, because the war is being pushed by NATO to continue and deepen and possibly lead to nuclear confrontation, but to have a higher peace movement to combat the merciless evil of this military-industrial complex and replace it with a new strategic and development architecture which takes into consideration the interests of every man, woman, and child on the planet. This means we have to fight the policies of war, fight against austerity, and fight against the control of the ability to think outside the bubble, which is the psychological warfare being deployed against the populations to create the narratives which essentially say you can't win, you can't succeed, there's no alternative. Well, there is an alternative, and that's what the International Peace Coalition is coming into existence to create. I'll be discussing that today with Helga Zepp-LaRouche on our weekly live dialogue. There's a link to that in the description section. I invite you to join us live if you can. It's at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. If not, it will be archived. But you can send us your questions at questions@schillerinstitute.org. So join us to discuss what you can do with us to fulfill the mission to make gentle the life in this world. Thanks for joining me, and I hope to see you this afternoon. Hello, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Support our independence to produce videos like these. Become a member of the LaRouche organization at thelarouche.org/member. By becoming a member for $25 or more, you'll get special access to the EIR Alert Daily Briefing and weekly magazine, which is what I read to stay on top of things.